Sup guys, Multiplier here, and today video 4 of my Ableton Basics series, and today running you through the preferences because there's quite a lot to set up, and by default it's set up as default, but there's a few things to kind of be aware of that you might want to change, and there's a few things you can definitely kind of ignore. So what I'm going to do is run you through the preferences, ignoring the bits that I personally don't think you need to worry about, and kind of telling you the few things that I would personally run through. Even if you're really new to Ableton, just to be aware of how it's set up. Cool, so first of all, start at the top on look and feel. Don't have to worry about them. The skin can be quite cool, so you can change the colours by default for Live 9. Set up as grey, for example, but I don't like the grey, it's boring, so I like it was in the old Ableton Live in Live 8. I don't know, it's got the right balance of being too colourful and kind of neutral at the same time. So there's a few others. Frost is alright, Calcium's alright as well. Actually, Calcium sucks. Most of these are really horrible, actually. In fact, I only think it's Frost. And see, Frost is kind of cool, but then I don't know, it doesn't quite look right. So I like Live 8, so that's a good thing to kind of play about with if you like a different look. This plugin thing can be quite important. So auto hide plugin windows, depending on if you want your plugin, if you say got a plugin window open on one channel and you want it to stay there while clicking on another one. So let's say you're like got something on your master bus, for example, and you want to kind of just leave it up in the background on another monitor, you'd want to turn that off so it wouldn't automatically hide. So have a play about with that. It's not a super beginner thing, but certainly something that can be quite useful to know. There is a setting for it, especially if you find it annoying that windows are automatically going away and you keep having to reopen them. So be aware of that. Audio, super important. Setting up your input and output. So normally for the output device, you'd set up it to be either built-in audio or your sound card. But because I'm recording this thing, it's set up to go into Soundflower. And I got my Scarlett 2i2 in for my input, which is my sound card. External sound card. So just be aware of where kind of what's going on with your input and output, because it's where you'd want to choose your external sound card if you're running one, for example. So you can probably ignore these unless you're doing something slightly more complicated. Sample rate, 48's fine. 441's probably fine as well. Probably don't really need the higher sample rates, to be honest. The important thing is whenever you set it, it changes the settings on your sound card as well if it's external. So sometimes it can be a bit temperamental, so you have to like choose it a few times, but just be aware of what it is and remember 48,000 is probably about right. Anyone that tells you any more, probably not really. You don't need it any higher. So yeah, default sample rate pitch conversion. Might as well do high quality. I guess if you've got a slow computer, you can turn it down. Buffer size, again, leave it as it is unless you've got a really slow computer, in which case change it. Probably will leave this kind of stuff you don't need to. These are the test tones, which will be quite useful if you want to see, like, say, if there's something wrong with your speakers maybe, or you want to see maybe how low your speakers kind of reproduce sounds to. So it can be useful to see kind of how far into the sub-frequencies your speakers go, just for like knowing what is coming out your speakers. So that can be quite cool. MIDI sync, if you haven't got a control surface, you don't need to worry about this. I think if you plug in a keyboard as well, it will come up, but most keyboards will automatically set themselves up as soon as you plug them in. So will most control surfaces as well, but it can be useful to know that you can manually select stuff here. And takeover mode can be quite useful to play about with if you've got a control surface. File and folder, this is quite useful. Save current set as default. So I know a lot of people tend to, there's certain things they do as soon as they start a new project. So whether it's set up a channel for sending kicks by itself, like almost like ghost kicks or whatever, for sidechain compression. Some people will set up one of those by default. Some people always set up their drum racks in a certain way, or maybe they set up, I don't know, drums, bass groups, and they do a few things every time basically, and you want to save yourself the hassle of setting all that up every time you open a project. Now what you can do is save like a default project. So you set it up exactly how you want, and then you click save, and then that'll save basically your current project as the default. So whenever you start a new project, it opens all up. So for me, I haven't done that much. All I've basically done is stuck a spectrum analyzer on the master and each audio channel, and I've locked the range. And the reason I've locked the range to this is just because I find it really useful to see where the sub bass is hitting and what it's doing, because sub bass is something that I kind of use my eye a lot for, because it's a lot easier to kind of mix and just see what's going on with your eyes, because sub bass is a nightmare to kind of get reproduced correctly in a room, given monitors and room and all that kind of stuff. So I set up all these spectrums on all my channels so I can see what's going on. Every time I have a track, I stick one on, so I thought, why don't I just set up my default project with that? Which is quite cool. You can also do the same with each track, so every time you bring up, say, like a new audio track, it comes with one of these spectrums on, or any combination of effects. So if you've got if there's, for example, a certain chain of effects you always have on every channel or on the master channel, you can stick them on, for example. Cool. Create analysis files, and leave that. You can move your temporary folder about if you want your temporary folders on different partitions and all that kind of. If you're short on space, you might need to move your temporary folder, but most people are fine where it is. That's all fine. Yeah, if you're loading up plugins, I'll go into this in more depth in my plugin video, but if you need to kind of rescan for plugins, it's useful to know you can do it there. And then make sure it's all kind of turned on like it is. I think by default it's fine, but it's useful to know. Library, again, it's fine, you don't need to worry about that. Record, warp, all this kind of stuff. This is where it gets a little bit more important as far as how you work. So recording, you can change the settings, and this is whenever you're recording something in, that's because there's a record, it's the settings. So I find the count-ins really useful, just 2 bars. It means you've got a bit of time to prepare yourself for whatever you're doing, whether it's recording a MIDI line on a keyboard or recording a vocal or anything at all. So that can be quite cool. 16-bit WAVs are fine most of the time, to be honest. I mean, 24-bit WAV, I should probably stick it as 24-bit WAV, but 16 is fine, save a bit of space. Again, this exclusive is, I forget which is on and which is off. Okay, yeah, I think I remember which way around it is. So basically, when you arm a track, I think I showed you briefly in the last video, it's when you want to, if it's an audio track, if you arm it, it means it will take an incoming signal, and if you're arming a MIDI track, it allows you to kind of take MIDI input. So it allows you to kind of play something on the instrument, for example. So if you want it set up so you can only ever arm one track at a time, I'd stick it on here. I find it easier because most of the time you don't need to play multiple instruments at once, and you don't need to record multiple things at once. So it's best just to leave it on, and then you don't accidentally, you don't have to keep turning things off and on, because if you're playing one instrument and then you want to play another one, if you don't tick that, then you'll need to turn it off and then turn the new one on instead of just turning the new one on. So it's not too big of a deal, but I find it a lot easier to work like this. And similarly with solo, this means you can only solo one channel at a time. Just means if you're soloing different channels, you don't need to turn off each one every time. So that's cool. That's all fine. So, oh yeah, default warp mode. Super important you're aware of warping. So I think on the next video is the warping one. But knowing which is a default warp mode can save a lot of time, because I think by default it comes on beats, but I virtually never use beats as a warp mode, and I much prefer it to default to repitch, and it's just the way I'm used to things. And then if I need to change it to texture or complex or anything like that, I can do it in the individual clip. I just prefer having the default warp mode as a repitch, so that can save a bit of time. You'll spend a lot of your time dragging in clips and dragging in samples and then having to warp them, so having the warp mode default, the one you use the most, can save a lot of time. Auto warp long samples, I think that might be turned on by default, but I definitely prefer to have it turned off, just because if you're dragging in a track and then it can warp it and then you sometimes forget that it's warped, just a lot easier. I personally get used to the fact that long samples don't warp automatically. I just find it a lot easier because it's very rarely that I want a long sample automatically warped. Saying that, for short samples like loops, you want it warped because you don't have to warp it every time. If you don't know what warping is yet, that probably didn't make too much sense, but after you watch the next video, it will. Warping's just like the difference between session review and arrangement review, super integral part of the way live works. Cool, and create fades on edge of clips. I turn that on. Again, super important, because basically, if you don't have this on, what can happen is every time you reach the end of a clip, you can get a clicking sound. Because if at the end of the clip, the kind of the waveform isn't at 0, it will create a click. So what this fade does is it kind of fades that last little bit to 0. So it's like 4 milliseconds or something. I forget the exact amount, but it's a super, super, super short fade, but it's enough of a fade for you not to get that click. So basically turn it on. The only reason it's there to turn off is because some people, there are certain instances where you might not want it to have that really short fade, but pretty much all the time you can't hear the fade. You want it on. So yeah, turn it on. Otherwise you'll get clicking and you won't know why. Launch, default launch mode. I think trigger's default, leave it on trigger. Default launch quantization. Global's probably fine. Obviously, if you've got your own setup, or especially if you're doing some playing live production work, you might want to change it for that need, but global's fine for most people. Again, with all these settings, it's probably fine. If you know to change these settings, you're doing something slightly more advanced anyway. CPU, I'm not rewiring, so you can probably leave that. You might as well turn multi-core, multiprocessor support on. I think it comes on anyway. And again, yeah, licenses, no big deal. I'd have to get software updates turned on. No need to turn that on. Cool, I think that's it. How long was that? 11 minutes, quite a long for preferences, but it's worth just going through it slowly, making sure it's all set up and making sure you're aware of a few things. Especially because one of the advantages of Ableton is you can work however you like. So it's useful to set it up in such a way that you're not spending unnecessary time setting things up. So the whole point is you're creating stuff. You don't want to be doing technical things if you don't have to. So yeah, set up default templates, all that kind of stuff. Sweet. Been Multiplier, end of video 4.